Thanksgiving has always been my favorite holiday. No pressure of gifts like Christmas, no over-commercialized nonsense like Valentine's Day, just food, family, and the warm kind of chaos that only comes when you've got too many people crammed into one house. This year, though, it felt different. And not in a good way. The morning started like it always did, me rushing around the kitchen, trying to get the turkey into the oven while juggling side dishes, and my husband, Jake, pretending to be helpful. "You sure you don't need me for anything, babe?" he asked, leaning casually against the counter, sipping his coffee. "Yeah, I'm sure," I said, glancing at the clock. "But maybe keep an eye on the kids when they wake up. I don't want them sneaking pie before dinner like last year." He grinned, gave me a quick peck on the cheek, and sauntered off to the living room, where the football game was already blaring. That's Jake for you, always finding an excuse to disappear right when I need him most. By noon, the house was full. My brothers, Mike and Danny, showed up first, carrying an embarrassing amount of beer. "You're lucky Mom's not here to see this," I joked as they loaded the fridge. "Hey, it's Thanksgiving," Mike said with a shrug. "Beer counts as a side dish." Then came Jake's best friend, Steve, with his signature cocky grin and a bottle of whiskey. "Thought I'd bring the good stuff," he said, handing it over like he was doing me a favor. "Great," I muttered under my breath. Steve had always rubbed me the wrong way, too loud, too smug, and way too close to Jake. But Jake loved him, and I'd long since stopped trying to fight it. The neighbors drifted in next, the Carsons from across the street, and Tom and Linda from a few doors down. Before long, the house was buzzing with conversation, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. On the surface, everything seemed perfect. But there was this tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. I first noticed it when I caught Jake and Steve whispering in the hallway. They stopped the second I walked by, their faces all too casual. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to sound lighthearted. "Yeah, just talking about the game," Jake said, a little too quickly. Steve just smirked and wandered off toward the kitchen. It wasn't the only strange thing. Later, while I was setting the table, Danny pulled me aside. "Hey, Em," he said, his voice low. "You good?" "Why wouldn't I be?" I asked, glancing over at him. He hesitated, scratching the back of his neck. "I don't know. Jake's just been. I mean, he seems off. Like, distracted or something." I waved him off. "He's always like this during football season. You know how he gets." "Yeah, maybe," Danny said, but he didn't look convinced. Dinner was where things really started to feel weird. Jake was quieter than usual, barely touching his food, and every time I tried to catch his eye, he looked away. Steve, on the other hand, was his usual obnoxious self, cracking jokes that were just a little too inappropriate and laughing louder than anyone else. At one point, he made some offhand comment about how Jake was lucky to have a wife like me. It should have been a compliment, but the way he said it made my skin crawl. After dinner, while everyone else was in the living room, I stayed behind to clean up. It's not like Jake offered to help. He and Steve were huddled on the couch, heads bent together, whispering like two kids plotting a prank. I watched them from the kitchen, my chest tightening with something I couldn't quite name. "Hey," Mike said, stepping into the kitchen with an empty beer bottle. "You need a hand?" I shook my head. "Nah, I've got it." He leaned against the counter, studying me for a moment. "You sure everything's okay?" "Why does everyone keep asking me that?" I snapped, immediately regretting it. "Sorry. It's just been a long day." Mike didn't push it, but he gave me a look that said he didn't believe me. And honestly, I wasn't sure I believed myself. By the time everyone left, the house was a mess, and I was too tired to care. Jake disappeared upstairs without so much as a good night, leaving me alone with my thoughts. As I sat there on the couch, staring at the empty whiskey bottle Steve had left behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Really wrong, and I had no idea what I was going to do about it. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of Jake's alarm blaring from his side of the bed. Except he wasn't there. His side was empty, the sheets cold. For a second, I thought maybe he'd fallen asleep on the couch, but when I went downstairs, he was already dressed, pouring coffee like he hadn't just disappeared on me last night. "Morning," he said casually, not even looking up. "Morning," I replied, watching him carefully. He had this way of pretending everything was fine, like his silence and avoidance didn't mean anything. I used to admire that about him, his ability to keep calm, to brush off problems. Now, it felt more like a mask. "You're up early," I said, trying to sound casual. "Got a lot of work to catch up on," he said, grabbing his travel mug and heading for the door. "Don't wait up for me tonight. Might be a late one." Before I could say anything, he was gone, leaving me standing there with this gnawing feeling in my gut. Mike and Danny came by later that morning to pick up some things they'd left. I was still in my pajamas, cradling my second cup of coffee, when they walked in. "Rough night?" Danny asked, nodding toward me. "Something like that," I muttered. Mike gave me this look, half concerned, half like he was trying to figure out what to say. "Look, Em," he started, "there's something I need to tell you." I froze. "What is it?" He glanced at Danny, who just shrugged, like he was saying, "Your call, man." Mike sighed and leaned against the counter. "Last week, I was out with some friends at that bar on Main. And I saw Jake there." "Okay, so what?" "He wasn't alone." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. "What do you mean?" I asked, even though I already knew. My stomach was churning, my hands tightening around my coffee mug. "There was this woman," Mike said carefully. "They were in a booth, talking. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal, but then," he grabbed her hand. "And they just sat there like that for a while. I didn't know if I should say something or if it was, like, nothing. But after last night, I don't know. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to scream, to throw my coffee mug against the wall and demand answers. The other part of me wanted to crawl back into bed and pretend Mike had never said anything. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I finally managed to ask. "I wasn't sure if it was worth making a big deal over," he said, his voice low. "But something feels off, Em." "You know it does." I didn't respond. What was there to say? He wasn't wrong. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I couldn't stop replaying Mike's words in my head. I couldn't stop picturing Jake sitting in some dimly lit bar, holding another woman's hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. By the time Jake got home that night, I'd worked myself into a frenzy. I tried to act normal, tried to smile, and made small talk, but every time I looked at him, all I could think was, who was she? And why didn't he tell me? Jake must have noticed something was off, because he kept glancing at me during dinner. "Are you okay?" he finally asked, his fork hovering over his plate. "Yeah, I'm fine," I lied, stabbing at my food. I couldn't confront him. Not yet. I needed to be sure. That night, while Jake was in the shower, I noticed his phone sitting on the nightstand. Usually, it was glued to his side, but he must have forgotten it in his hurry to rinse off. My heart was racing as I picked it up. The screen was still unlocked, almost like fate was giving me a chance. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the Messages app. I'd always told myself I'd never be that kind of wife, the one who snoops through her husband's phone. But right now, I didn't care. The first thing I saw was a message from Steve. "We need to talk before she finds out." My breath caught in my throat. Before who finds out? Before I find out? There were other messages, too, from a number I didn't recognize. They were short and vague, but the tone was unmistakable. "Can't wait to see you again. Last night was amazing. When can we talk?" I felt sick. My hands were shaking as I put the phone back where I found it, my mind racing with questions I didn't have answers to. Jake came out of the bathroom a few minutes later, towel drying his hair. "You coming to bed?" he asked, like everything was perfectly normal. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Just give me a minute." I waited until he was asleep before grabbing my phone and texting Mike. "I need to talk. Tomorrow." The next morning, I met Mike at the diner downtown, the one we always went to as kids. It was quiet for a Saturday, just a few people scattered in booths. Mike was already there when I arrived, stirring his coffee and looking like he hadn't slept much. "You okay?" he asked as I slid into the seat across from him. Not really, I admitted. He gave me a look, like he was trying to figure out how much to push. What happened? I took a deep breath and told him everything, the messages, the strange behavior, the fact that Jake had practically sprinted out the door that morning before I could even say good morning. Mike didn't interrupt. He just listened, his jaw tightening a little more with every word. When I finished, he leaned back in his seat, letting out a low whistle. Damn, Em. That's rough. Yeah, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. So, what are you going to do? That was the million-dollar question, wasn't it? Part of me wanted to confront Jake right away, to throw his phone in his face and demand an explanation. But another part of me, the part that had been hurt before, knew better. If I was going to get answers, real answers, I needed to be smart. I don't know, I said finally. I mean, what if I'm wrong? What if there's some innocent explanation? Mike raised an eyebrow. Come on, Em. You really think those messages were innocent? No, I admitted. But I need proof. Real proof. Mike nodded, like he understood. Okay. So, what's the plan? Back at home, I couldn't shake the feeling that Jake's phone held more answers than I'd found the night before. But this time, it wasn't sitting conveniently on the nightstand. Jake had it with him, as usual, tucked away like a secret he couldn't risk anyone uncovering. By the time he got home, I'd already decided what I was going to do. Hey, I said casually as he walked through the door. How was work? Fine, he said, shrugging off his jacket. Busy? Yeah, a little. He was lying, I could tell. Jake had always been a terrible liar. His voice got tight, his answers too short. I wondered if he could tell I was lying, too, that the smile I gave him was just as fake as his words. That night, I waited until Jake fell asleep before slipping out of bed and heading downstairs. I didn't have his phone, but I had something almost as good, our laptop. Jake was logged into his email there, and I was willing to bet he hadn't bothered to sign out. I was right. At first, I didn't find much. A lot of junk mail, work-related stuff, and the usual spam. But then I saw it, a thread with the same number I'd seen on his phone. The messages were worse than I'd expected. Can't stop thinking about you. Last weekend was amazing. When can we do it again? She doesn't suspect anything, does she? My hands were shaking so badly, I almost dropped the laptop. I stared at the screen, my mind spinning. Last weekend. That was when Jake had gone on his so-called work trip. I'd believed him, of course. Why wouldn't I? I closed the laptop and sat there in the dark, my heart pounding so loud I was sure Jake could hear it from upstairs. The next morning, I called Danny. What's up? He asked when he picked up. I need your help, I said. Danny didn't ask questions. He just showed up at the house an hour later, his expression serious. You sure about this? He asked as I explained the plan. No, I admitted. But I don't have a choice. Together, we set up a small camera in the living room, hidden in a corner where it would catch everything. If Jake was going to lie to me, I wanted to catch him in the act. Are you sure he's not going to notice? Danny asked, stepping back to admire his handiwork. Jake never notices anything, I said, my voice bitter. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Jake was out again, another long day at work, he claimed. I didn't believe him for a second. When he finally came home that evening, I could barely look at him. You okay? He asked, his brow furrowing. Yeah, I lied. You've been quiet lately, he said, sitting down next to me on the couch. I'm just tired, I said, shrugging him off. He didn't push it, which only made me more suspicious. That night, after Jake fell asleep, I went back downstairs to check the camera. My hands were shaking as I pulled up the footage. At first, there was nothing, just me and Danny setting up, and then a few hours of an empty room. But then I saw it. Jake, standing in the living room, his phone pressed to his ear. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but the way he paced, the way he kept glancing toward the stairs, it was obvious. He didn't want me to hear. My heart sank as I watched him laugh at something the person on the other end said. He looked happy. Happier than I'd seen him in months. I shut the laptop and sat there in the dark, my chest tight with anger and betrayal. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining things. Jake was hiding something. And now, I had the proof to confront him. The next morning, I called Mike and Danny again. I didn't want to do this alone. Are you sure about this? Mike asked when he arrived. He was sitting at the kitchen table, his arms crossed, looking at me like I'd lost my mind. No, I admitted. But I can't sit around pretending everything's fine. I need answers. Danny leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. What's the plan? I hesitated. The truth was, I didn't really have one. All I knew was that I couldn't keep this to myself anymore. I'm going to talk to him, I said finally. Tonight. I'll tell him what I found, and I'll see what he says. Mike snorted. You really think he's just going to come clean? I don't know, I said honestly. But I have to try. The day dragged on, every minute stretching into what felt like an hour. Jake was out of the house again, probably with her, though the thought made my stomach churn. Mike and Danny stuck around, keeping me company and helping me rehearse what I was going to say. By the time Jake finally got home that evening, I was a wreck. My brothers were still there, sitting in the living room like they were waiting for a show to start. Hey, Jake said, glancing between the three of us. What's going on? Sit down, I said, my voice firmer than I expected. He blinked, clearly confused, but did as I asked. Okay. What's this about? I took a deep breath, my hands trembling. I know, Jake. Know what? He asked, his brow furrowing. Don't play dumb, Mike snapped, before I could respond. Mike, stay out of this, Jake said, his tone sharp. No, I said, cutting him off. He's right. Don't lie to me, Jake. I saw the messages. I know you've been talking to someone. I know about last weekend. For a second, Jake just stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like he didn't know what to say. You went through my phone, he said finally, his voice low. That's what you're worried about? I shot back, my anger flaring. Not the fact that you've been sneaking around behind my back? Jake ran a hand through his hair, leaning back on the couch. It's not what you think, he said. Then what is it? I demanded. It's complicated, he said, avoiding my gaze. That's not an answer, Mike said, leaning forward. Come on, man. If you've got nothing to hide, just say it. Jake glared at him but didn't respond. You owe me the truth, I said, my voice shaking. Who is she? It's not like that, Jake said finally. She's just someone I've been talking to. That's all. Talking to? I repeated, my voice dripping with disbelief. Those messages didn't sound like just talking. Jake sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. I didn't mean for it to go this far. He stopped, his words hanging in the air. You what? Danny asked, his tone icy. Jake didn't answer, the silence was unbearable. I felt like the walls were closing in, like I couldn't breathe. Is it Steve? I asked suddenly, the thought hitting me like a punch to the gut. What? Jake said, his eyes snapping to mine. Is he covering for you? I pressed. Because I know he knows. He's been acting weird, too. Jake's face hardened. Leave Steve out of this. That's not exactly reassuring, Mike said, his voice tight. Jake stood up, pacing the room. Look, it's not. It's not what you're thinking. Yes, I've been talking to someone, but it's not serious. It was just a distraction. A distraction from what? I asked, my voice breaking. He stopped pacing, turning to face me. From us, he said quietly. The words hit me like a slap. For a moment, no one said anything. Then Mike stood up, his jaw clenched. You're unbelievable, man, he said, his voice low and angry. She's been bending over backward for you, and this is how you repay her? I didn't mean for it to happen, Jake said, his voice defensive. It just got out of hand. Danny shook his head, looking at me. What do you want to do, Em? I didn't know. My mind was spinning, my chest tight with hurt and anger. All I could think was, how did we get here? Jake sat back down on the couch, his head in his hands. My brothers stood like statues on either side of the room, their eyes locked on him. I felt stuck in the middle of it all, like I was the referee in a game I never agreed to play. So, what's her name? I asked finally. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a knife. Emily, don't, he started, looking up at me. Don't what? I snapped. Don't ask questions? Don't demand answers? You've been lying to me for months, Jake. I think I've earned the right to know her damn name. He sighed, leaning back against the couch. Her name's Tara. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Tara. I didn't know her, but just hearing her name made everything feel more real. She wasn't just some anonymous other woman anymore, she had a name, and suddenly she felt like a thread I could touch, see, and hate. Do you love her? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jake didn't answer right away, and that silence was worse than anything he could have said. Finally, he shook his head. No. It wasn't about that. Then what was it about? I asked, my voice rising. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you risked everything we have for someone you don't even care about. It wasn't like that, he said, his tone defensive. I didn't mean for it to happen. We met at a workplace, and we just started talking. She listened, Em. She made me feel. Feel what? I asked sharply. Because apparently, whatever she gave you is worth destroying our marriage over. Jake ran a hand through his hair, his frustration clear. I've been stressed, okay? Work's been hell, and things between us haven't exactly been great either. I felt like you didn't even see me anymore. I stared at him, my chest tightening. So this is my fault? I asked, my voice trembling. No, he said quickly. I'm not saying that. I just felt lost, and Tara was there. She didn't expect anything from me. She didn't nag or. Stop, I said, holding up a hand. Just stop. You don't get to blame me for your choices, Mike, who had been standing silently in the corner, finally spoke up. You're unbelievable, man. You're sitting here, trying to justify cheating on my sister because you had a little stress? Grow up. Mike, stay out of this, Jake said, his tone sharp. No, I won't, Mike snapped, stepping closer. You think I'm just going to stand here and watch you destroy her? You don't deserve her. Mike, I said, cutting him off. I appreciate it, but this is between me and Jake. Fine, Mike said, backing off, though his glare didn't soften. Before I could say anything else, there was a knock at the door. For a moment, we all froze, the tension in the room so thick it was suffocating. Were you expecting someone? I asked Jake. He shook his head, looking just as confused as I felt. I walked to the door, my heart pounding, and opened it. And there he was. Steve. Hey, Emily, he said, his face splitting into that cocky grin I'd always hated. Is Jake home? What are you doing here? I asked, my voice colder than I intended. Steve glanced past me into the house, his grin fading as he noticed Mike and Danny. Oh. Didn't realize it was a family meeting. Steve, now's not a good time, Jake said from the couch. Yeah, well, it's kind of important, Steve said, pushing past me into the house. Mike said, backing off, though his glare didn't soften. The room felt even smaller with Steve in it, his presence filling the space like an unwelcome shadow. He looked at Jake, then at me, then back at Jake. Did you tell her? He asked, his voice low. Jake froze, his eyes wide. Steve. She deserves to know, Steve said, cutting him off. What are you talking about? I asked, my stomach dropping. Steve turned to me, his expression uncharacteristically serious. Jake wasn't just talking to Tara. He wasn't exactly faithful with her either. The room went silent. I felt like I'd just been punched in the gut. What the hell are you talking about? Mike demanded, stepping forward. Steve ignored him, his eyes locked on me. Tara's not the only one, Emily. There have been others. My vision blurred, and for a second, I thought I might pass out. Others? I whispered, my voice barely audible. Jake stood up, his face pale. Steve, shut the hell up. No, Steve said firmly. You've been lying to her for too long. She deserves to know the truth. You bastard, Danny said, his voice shaking with rage. How many, Jake? How many women? I don't know. Jake shouted, his voice breaking. I don't know, okay? I lost count. The words hit me like a truck. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. My legs gave out, and I sank into the chair behind me, my head spinning. Mike and Danny were shouting now, their voices blending together in a storm of anger. But I couldn't focus on them. All I could hear was Jake's voice in my head, over and over. I lost count. Finally, I looked up at Jake, my chest heaving with anger and pain. Get out, I said, my voice trembling. What? He asked, his eyes wide. I said, get out, I repeated, louder this time. I don't care where you go, but you're not staying here. Not after this. Jake hesitated, his mouth opening like he wanted to argue. But one look at my face must have told him I wasn't backing down. He grabbed his coat and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. For a moment, no one said anything. Then Steve let out a low whistle. Well, that went about as well as I expected. Get out, I snapped, glaring at him. Steve held up his hands in mock surrender. Fine. I'm going. But for what it's worth, Emily. You deserve better than him. With that, he left, leaving me alone with my brothers. I didn't cry until they were gone. I waited until the house was empty, until the only sound was the clock ticking in the kitchen. And then I broke. I cried for everything I'd lost, for the trust that had been shattered, for the life I thought I had. And when I was done, I wiped my face, took a deep breath, and started thinking about what came next. The house felt eerily quiet the next morning. Jake's absence hung in the air like a fog, unavoidable, yet oddly liberating. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the pressure of his presence, the weight of pretending everything was okay. Mike and Danny had texted to check in, offering to come back, but I told them I needed some time alone. They respected that, though I could tell they weren't thrilled about leaving me to deal with the fallout by myself. I spent the morning cleaning. Scrubbing the counters, vacuuming the floors, even rearranging the living room furniture. It wasn't about making the house look good, it was about reclaiming my space. For too long, everything in this house had been about Jake. His favorite chair, his stupid sports memorabilia, his endless clutter. Now, it was mine again. Around noon, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Jake. Can we talk? I stared at the screen for a long time, my emotions swirling. Part of me wanted to ignore him, to block his number and move on. But another part of me, the part that still remembered the man I fell in love with, wanted answers. Not in person, I finally replied. What do you need to say? It took him a while to respond, and when he did, his message was long and rambling. He apologized, said he never meant to hurt me, and blamed his actions on stress and his own insecurities. He didn't mention Tara, or Steve, or the other women. It was all about him, how he felt, what he had been going through. I didn't reply. Later that afternoon, I met up with Mike and Danny at their favorite sports bar. It wasn't the kind of place I usually went to, but right now, I needed the comfort of family, even if it meant enduring the smell of stale beer and the sound of a dozen TVs blaring at once. How you holding up? Danny asked as I slid into the booth. I'm okay, I said. And for the first time, it didn't feel like a lie. Mike handed me a beer, his expression serious. So, what's the plan? I don't know, I admitted. Jake's staying with Steve, at least for now. He's been texting, but I don't think I'm ready to talk to him. You don't owe him anything, Danny said firmly. I know, I said. But I need to figure out what I want. Whether I'm willing to try and fix this, or if it's better to just let go. Mike leaned forward, his eyes locked on mine. Look, Em. Whatever you decide, we've got your back. You're not doing this alone. I smiled, my chest tightening with gratitude. Thanks, guys. The next few weeks were hard, but they were also eye-opening. Jake continued to reach out, sending me long messages about how much he wanted to work things out, how he was willing to go to therapy, and how he'd do whatever it took to make things right. I thought about it. I thought about the life we'd built together, the good times, and the dreams we'd once shared. But every time I thought about forgiving him, I remembered the messages. The lies. The way he had looked at me and denied everything, even when the truth was staring us both in the face. In the end, it wasn't about whether or not I loved him. It was about whether I could trust him again. And the answer was no. The divorce papers were surprisingly easy to file. Jake didn't fight me on anything, probably out of guilt more than anything else. I kept the house, my car, and the freedom to start over. Mike and Danny were there for me every step of the way, whether it was helping me pack up Jake's things or just sitting with me on the nights when the loneliness felt overwhelming. You're stronger than you think, Mike told me one night as we sat on the back porch, a couple of beers between us. You've got this. And he was right. It wasn't easy, rebuilding my life from the ground up. But little by little, I started to find myself again. I went back to school, started working toward a degree in psychology, something I'd always wanted to do but had put off for Jake's sake. I reconnected with old friends, took up yoga, and even adopted a rescue dog named Max. He was scruffy and a little clumsy, but he made me laugh, and that was something I hadn't done in a long time. One day, months after Jake had moved out, I got a call from Steve. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. What do you want? I asked, my tone colder than I'd intended. Just wanted to say I'm sorry, he said. For everything. I should have told you the truth sooner. Yeah, you should have, I said. There was a pause on the other end, and then he sighed. For what it's worth, I think you're better off without him. I know I am, I said, and for the first time, I truly believed it. One in a long time. Looking back, I don't regret what happened. It was painful, messy, and it nearly broke me. But it also forced me to take a hard look at my life and figure out what I wanted, what I deserved. I deserved honesty. I deserved loyalty. I deserved someone who would fight for me, not against me. Jake wasn't that person. And that's okay. Because now, I'm finally learning to fight for myself.